next, I would like to introduce Dr. Robert Bertini, and who will be moderating the keynote session. Rob is the professor and head of the School of Civil and Construction Engineering at Oregon State University. And we're really thrilled that having Rob back to the Pacific Northwest after being away for a few years. And Rob has a lot of experience and a track record of successes with the UTC program. And just without further ado, so Rob, please take over from here.
Great. Thank you very much, Haijong, and good morning, everyone. It's an honor for me to have the opportunity to participate in this PacTrans event, and even a greater honor for me to have the chance to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Amanda Pietz, who's the Administrator for Policy, Data, and the Analysis Division at the Oregon Department of Transportation. Good morning, Amanda. And I've actually known Amanda for a long time, maybe not, maybe I won't say the number of years, but it's been fantastic to watch your progression through the organization, and we're really grateful for your leadership, not only here in Oregon, but in the Pacific Northwest and nationally. So just to quickly describe what Amanda does, she oversees the work of the Policy, Planning, Research, Data, and Climate Office at ODOT. She was actually the inaugural Climate Office Director. She established that new program and set the strategic climate direction for the agency. She's been with ODOT for almost 15 years and has been involved in setting multimodal policy and investment direction. She's also received the AASHTO President's Award for Planning, and she currently chairs the AASHTO Subcommittee on Air Quality, Climate Change, and Energy. And her background before ODOT is that of an archaeologist, which is fascinating to me, where she worked with Northwest tribes, prehistoric sites, Victorian era accoutrements, and Easter Island archaeology. Would love to hear you talk about that sometime. But without further ado, let's give a virtual welcome and hand for Amanda Pietz.
Great, thank you, Rob. Really appreciate the introduction, and it's been a pleasure knowing you all these years, and quite an honor to be here with you today. So today I'm going to talk to you about the impacts of climate change to transportation and how we adapt to that. I want to start with setting the stage here, going all the way back in the Wayback Machine to the year 2000 when I graduated high school. So Rob, don't worry, I dated myself here, and darn, that's starting to be a long time ago. Anyway. The recognition of climate change as a thing in Oregon really started to take root around that time. Research on the topic was starting to come more mainstream, and by 2007, a center was created called the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute. Around the same time, the Oregon Global Warming Commission was created, which is a consortium of state agencies, directors, legislators, and advocates that are empowered to examine Oregon's changing climate and identify what we need to do as a state. By 2009 and on into the early 2010s, climate legislation was forthcoming with particular emphasis on greenhouse gas emission reduction and the biggest emitter in the state, transportation. That's when ODOT's climate consciousness awoke, being driven really by legislation to look at ways that the transportation sector can help Oregon achieve its climate goals. It was the first time that we started to openly use the words climate change and recognize that we have a role in creating the problem in the first place. As the idea of climate change is real took hold, people finally started to realize, crap, this is going to impact us, and we need to understand that. So state agencies collaboratively started to look at what the risks of climate change might be and created a multi-agency adaptation framework. For a time, Oregon glided blissfully along on the notion that we've identified climate change as a thing and started to create some plans. So we patted ourselves on the back for a while. But after minimal to slow progress in the decade hence, another round of pushing on the topic of climate change commenced with controversial and unsuccessful cap and trade legislation, and ultimately led to direction from the governor's office on specific actions. ODOT's work on climate change ramped up, and true and firm commitments were made to take action. I'll get to those in a minute. Before I do, part of talking with you about the timing of events is not only to illustrate the freshness of this work, but to highlight my beliefs in why it ramped up at the turn of the millennium. To me, it has everything to do with the visibility and the tangibility of the problem. While climate change was talked about in years prior, motivation to sustain action did not start in earnest until people could see and feel the problem. In the early 2000s, we started to see tree blights and bug infestations appearing in our forests and impacting our timber harvest. By the 2010s, evidence of climate change was more widespread, more rain, higher surfs, and disappearing coastlines. And now the world is literally on fire. People have lost their lives, their homes, their businesses. It's all around us and it's closing in. Now people are ready to take action. So I alluded to ODOT's journey through this time in the previous slide. Our first major step was the creation of what we call the STS, the Statewide Transportation Strategy. It's basically our carbon reduction roadmap for transportation. We started the effort in 2010 and completed the plan in 2013. At the time, support for the plan was pretty hesitant, especially to commit in any firm ways. So we really had to frame the plan as a if-then document. If you decide to address climate change, then here are the ways to do this. So that was really reflected by our Transportation Commission's decision at the time to only accept the statewide transportation strategy versus formally adopting it into policy. Adoption did not happen until 2018. So going back to 2013, when we finished the STS, many said, done, great, check the box. We did the planning work required of us. Nonetheless, there were those of us in the agency and outside that continued to push for action. An implementation plan was created, focusing on low-hanging fruit or some of the non-controversial smaller actions. So again, without widespread support, we were kind of left to do the things that weren't as politically controversial. In 2018, we took a look back at our progress. So we did a monitoring report. We noted that we had some great successes in things like creating a new transportation options program to focus on low and no emission modes. We created climate enabling policies and more, but it wasn't far enough. We proved to be significantly off the trajectory that we needed to be. So on our own volition, in recognition of the need for increased and intentional ramp up of implementation, we started talks of creating a climate office. The Governor's Office Executive Order 2004 only solidified this, and we formed the Climate Office in 2020. As Rob mentioned, I was the inaugural director of that Climate Office, and we really focused on three aspects of climate change: stopping the problem from getting worse, so mitigation; preparing for and responding to the impacts of climate change or adaptation; and then really I see it as the intersect between the two with a mind towards conservation, and that's sustainability. So my presentation today really focuses on adaptation, or in other words, resilience. So what is adaptation? What is climate resilience? We really see them as actions to reduce the vulnerability of natural and human systems, or to increase system resiliency in light of expected climate change or extreme weather events. I'd say that this photo is a perfect example. It shows trucks stranded by floodwaters on Interstate 84 in Eastern Oregon just a few years ago. So it really does affect the commerce, the economics, and everything else of the state. As we get into this mindset of understanding climate impacts and what we do, my emphasis is really on the users of the system, not on the system or the infrastructure itself. So the quote that I'd offer you here today is that it's not about the infrastructure. It's about how the infrastructure impacts the people who need to use it. Therefore, we need to consider how people escape when floods or wildfires sweep through their community. We need to ensure access to critical services and plan for detour routes. We must also think about the impacts of these events on all users of the transportation system and understand the principle of what's called climate justice. And that really proclaims that these people that are least likely to cause the problem are those who are most likely to be negatively affected by its impacts. So we've seen low-income and BIPOC communities hit hardest by many of the recent climate and extreme weather events that we've had in our state and elsewhere. And lastly, we need to consider how to keep the economy and commerce moving, keeping roadways functional in the face of climate change and recovering as quickly as possible to enable freight movement and people to be able to access jobs and critical services. So now I'd like to transition to climate hazards and their impacts. Now that we are constantly thinking about these from a user perspective, how do these threats impact people? Before I move off this slide, I just want to speak to this particular photograph real quickly. This is in Detroit, Oregon. which is off US 20. It's basically between Salem and Bend, after the 2020 wildfire season. It was a popular pit stop in a highly recreated area. Now that community is decimated. This is basically what was left of Detroit. And they're really in a state of limbo. Do they rebuild? What do they do? So these have very clear and impactful threats. So staying on the theme of wildfire, just in the past 5 years, several million acres in Oregon have burned. There have been lives lost, thousands of people have been displaced, homes, businesses, and even towns destroyed like Detroit that I just showed. Each year seems to be no better than the last, and this decade seems exponentially worse than the previous ones. From the roadway perspective, wildfires trigger response to identify and clear access routes and get the transportation system up and running. As wildfires cover a large geographic area, cleanup and response can be pretty challenging for DOT like us. We've not only had the responsibility for the cleanup of debris on our roadways, like fallen and burned trees, we must also remove still standing hazard trees along our right-of-way and help to assist homeowners where we can. While debris cleanup is a primary response after a wildfire, we do have other infrastructure repair and replacement work as well. Where wildfires cross the highway or burn adjacent, our guardrails are often incinerated and require wholesale replacement to ensure continued safety for the traveling public. In rare cases of extreme heat, we also see pavement spalling and cracking, requiring grinding and repaving work. All of this damage has resulted in expensive and steep increases in costs for ODOT's maintenance efforts. Just in the past 5 years, we spent now near $500 million on wildfire cleanup alone. The problem is only likely to get worse. Oregon's wildfire season is now expected to become longer, and fires are likely to occur more frequently, more extensively, and more severely. This increase in activity is expected to occur across the state, with the biggest changes projected in Eastern Oregon. This map shows that the projected increase of burned area by the end of the century, coverage is nearly complete across the state. So on the other end of the spectrum, transitioning from wildfires now to extreme precipitation. In our higher elevation areas of the state, extreme precipitation can take the form of snowfall, like shown in this photo of near whiteout conditions on Interstate 84. Snowfall between years can be variable, and individual volumes of storms are unpredictable. In addition to snowfall, extreme events of rain are pervasive across the state. The National Flood Insurance Program has identified locations in all of Oregon's 36 counties as flood prone, so it's across the entire state. Not only does extreme precipitation cause road closures, it also tends to affect multiple roadways simultaneously, making response challenging. In extreme cases, we have seen the rainfall events lead to total failure of the roadway, such as the collapse of culverts and sinkholes. In our more mountainous areas, steep slopes near rivers and along the coast, landslides are a challenge. So to give you a specific example, the Uxodin landslide, I'm probably saying that wrong, that happened in 2019. It was along US 101 in Southern Oregon. It covered a quarter mile of the roadway there. It took 2 weeks to clear the debris and to rebuild the sections. Those 2 weeks were estimated to cost the economy nearly $500,000 from delayed traffic and commodity deliveries. The challenge with landslides is that they're incredibly costly to treat with preventative measures, upwards of tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet, landslide cleanup costs ODOT around $4.5 million per year, and the risk is only expected to increase in the future due to wildfires, extreme precipitation events, droughts, and sea level rise, all of which tend to destabilize our slopes. With the exception of landslide mitigation, approaches for mitigating the risk of extreme precipitation are exponentially less when done proactively versus once the event has occurred and the infrastructure damage and loss. One of those options is upsizing our culverts where we can to allow for heavier stream flows. So moving on now to sea level rise. The entire western shore of our state is vulnerable to sea level rise, where we're losing an average of 1 meter of our coastline every single year to erosion. Coastal erosion is costly, spreading from wave erosion, weathering of rock, groundwater seepage, and surface runoff. The results are frequent and costly repairs. One small area of the coast, known as Beverly Beach, on average, every single year costs our agency about $250,000 to maintain. So it's just constantly eroding into the ocean. While coastal erosion has been a consistent and constant for US 101, climate change is exacerbating the problem. Intense rainfall events, storm surges, and more are not only becoming more frequent, they're becoming more severe, leading to landslides, bridge scour, and other problems. The costs and damage from all these threats are not only becoming more visible, they have directly and indirectly started to affect every single person in Oregon and in the Northwest in general. While we never want to minimize the tragic impacts of these events, the increased visibility, as I discussed at the beginning, has really started to propel not only recognition of the problem, but real action. Addressing these challenges starts with building understanding risks, mitigation options, and prioritization approach. Research is our foundation for that. PacTrans and others have helped to really advance our general understanding of the problem and help position us to help figure out how we move forward. Research has spanned all vulnerabilities, like shown here on this slide, and has been incorporated into our adaptation roadmap that I'll talk about in a moment. We are not at a point of permeation yet on research. We're at a point of starting to understand. More is needed, and I will highlight some of those future research needs in a moment. But the research to date has been really essential in helping us to understand climate hazards and impacts. We've started to use this information to create an adaptation roadmap. In that roadmap, we will use proactive strategies to identify how we move forward. And we'll set priorities for things like our assets, so culverts that I mentioned earlier, or corridors like US 101, and then statewide approaches like evacuation or lifeline routes. In the end, we'll have a better sense of the needed projects, programs, and investments, and importantly, be able to help understand the gap between what we can do and what we need to do. So that gap will help us to lead likely to future legislative asks and help to inform the public and set expectations for the level of service we can actually provide. Long-term, we'll integrate this information into all aspects of decision-making that we make. In the policy realm, we're starting to take action, building off not only the work of our adaptation plan, but the statewide adaptation framework. We can build off of the 6 aspects of resilience, from the economy to health, and then the built environment. ODOT's really at the center of the built environment, as are buildings, residences, and more. Under Oregon's current administrative rules, houses and businesses along the coast are allowed to armor the coastline, like the photo in the top right. But roadways, like Beverly Beach, which I mentioned earlier, and that's the photo shown there in the center, we're not allowed to armor the coastline for our transportation system. So we're trying to take some of the research findings and put that into a formal exception to the administrative rule in a way that's intended to shift the rules fundamentally to allow for riprap and other natural approaches to preserve the transportation infrastructure along Oregon's eroding coast. In addition to policy, the most direct form of action is investment. Some of these are reactive, some proactive, but all are designed to increase future resiliency. On the left side, you see a photo of a bridge that was completely washed out from a massive melting event at Mount Hood, causing the flooding of White River. The road was closed for weeks, and when we went back in to replace the bridge, we raised it up a foot to accommodate those future glacial flows. So that's one way we adapted. In the middle is a photo of US 395, where the mountainous areas drain into the valley. As you can see, we upsize our culverts, that's a huge culvert there, to this massive one, which can carry much greater volumes of water during extreme precipitation events. Lastly, the other example I'll share is work done in cooperation with other state and federal agencies to restore the natural floodplain along our coast in ways that will better accommodate flooding away from the transportation infrastructure. So we still have a lot of work ahead. We need to finalize the adaptation framework. So we have a roadmap for adaptation and climate resilience in Oregon. We need to continue to set the right policy framework and position our funding and investment in supportive ways. And of course, we need a continual flow of good information to ensure sound decisions. So this is a listing more of like a brainstorm list of some of the research needs that we have going forward. We still have gaps in understanding for all the hazards that we've mentioned, and overall to more intentionally bring in the equity lens, that climate justice perspective that I talked about earlier, in ways that we're making sure our priorities and our investments are reaching those BIPOC and low-income communities who are most effective. How do we take care of them first? How do we make priorities? And then also ways to collaborate with our tribal partners and others. So with that, I will turn it back to Mr. Bertini to help moderate us through some questions.
Great. Thank you, Amanda, for that inspiring presentation, and also basically for challenging all of us. We do have a large number of challenges out there, and I think you stated everything extremely clearly. And I think the researchers who are participating in this appreciated your addressing some future research needs. And let's hope that that we can turn some of those into real research projects and real actionable results. So I will try to take some of the questions. We have the first question here from Casey Berg. Do you anticipate this will change 100-year flood maps or the planning requirements within these areas? Are the events we've experienced recently exceeding these limits?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say we're still certainly tracking what the flood maps are showing, but we know that we need to update them. The recent events are showing that we're getting there a little faster, and not in a good way than we had hoped. We're reaching these levels more frequently, and even exceeding some of these levels. So we really are looking for some research, both at the national and the state level, to redo these and see what our true vulnerabilities are.
Thank you. We have another question from Stefan Konin. How is the balance between mitigation and adaptation at Oregon DOT? Is really rebuilding and repairing streets and bridges, to put it simply, the first priority over bringing down emissions as soon as possible? The U.S. carbon budget to stay within the 1.5 degree C goal is reached before 2030 at current emission levels. So good question.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, the focus of my presentation today was on the adaptation resilience side. If I were to give kind of a balance of the scale to where we focus our time, I would say it's more like 70% on the mitigation side. Like I mentioned, we recognize that we are the problems, transportation is. We're the highest emitting sector in the state and nationally. And we really need to curb those emissions to make sure that problems are not getting worse, and before we do irreparable damage. So on the mitigation side, there's a number of activities that we're focused on. I really talk about kind of three legs to that stool. The first is transitioning to cleaner vehicles and fuels. While one of the other legs to that stool is moving to low and no emission modes like biking, walking, and public transportation. We're trying to invest in those low and no emission modes to provide people choices and to reduce vehicle trips. But if we're successful, maybe we'll get to 25, maybe even 30% of mode share. But still, the majority of people are going to drive. So we need to affect those miles for every single mile driven. So transitioning to electrification is key to that. Those investments in low and no emissions modes. And then the third is pricing the transportation system. It is making sure that there is a cost signal to folks of the impacts of driving to climate and the environment. It has some other ancillary benefits to health, to congestion and other things. But by that price signal, it makes these other modes of transportation more cost competitive. So those are the three things that we're really pushing as a DOT, and we have a lot of staff and effort focused on the mitigation side and bringing down emissions.
Thank you very much. I was going to ask, hopefully we have some students listening and participating. And you know, in universities, we teach students about standards, and there are guidebooks and so on that we teach them about. It seems to me that some of today's students and early career professionals, they're going to have to write new standards and new guidebooks and things like that. Can you reflect on, you know, you talked about a couple examples where some replacements for projects, you know, raise the bridge or use a larger culvert. You know, how do we kind of get our heads around this idea that we can't just open the design manual anymore and kind of use a cookie cutter approach where we have to be much more creative? Can you reflect on how that, you know, how more early career transportation planning and engineering and other professionals can make a difference in this area?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do need to fundamentally shift some of the ways that we design, some of the ways that we build out the transportation system in general, both on the mitigation and the adaptation side. So in terms of lowering emissions, you know, what is the transportation of the system of the future that we're looking at? What are, from the hard science side, what are lower carbon materials and fuels that we can be using as we construct those transportation projects? Often I hear questions or concerns come up when we try to, say, increase the amount of recycled asphalt in our paving mix. People say, well, that it doesn't last as long. Therefore, you know, the emissions are actually higher over time. It creates more work. It's you know, a loss in the end. So we need more research to back up to understand the longevity, the cost, and how we transition to some of these lower carbon fuels and materials. On the resilient side, absolutely, we need some better understanding and research out there. We've tended to, we have, one thing I didn't talk about as much is the extreme heat that we experience in certain parts of the state. Sometimes that is leading to pavement failure. So I think making sure that we're setting standards to accommodate some of those more extreme temperatures that we're seeing out there. As well as just the infrastructure in general. So I talked about culverts a couple times. Replacing culverts isn't necessarily a cheap thing, especially if you're doing a pretty massive culvert. It's therefore then considered a bridge. What is the size that we really need? As we're going out there and we're replacing some of these things, we also don't want to overdo it to the point that we're being cost inefficient in what we're doing. So the better the data, the better the information, and using that and translating those into standards, best practices, those are going to be key for us practitioners as we move forward.
Thank you very much. There's a question, given that there may not be enough funding to fix infrastructure issues completely, how do you envision the solutions to these important issues to ensure operability of our transportation infrastructure system?
Yeah, so there's, it's a problem. So there's a couple tacks I'll take on this. One is of course, the answer I'll say is trying to find really cost-effective solutions that we can for the system. Even at that, we're still woefully underfunded on what we need to really address the problems. So we've got some tough conversations ahead. One approach to that is what I called lifeline routes earlier. We've done some work around lifeline routes for seismic hazard. And basically what we've done is identified a backbone system in the state. Should the Cascadia event occur, what are some of the key routes to emergency facilities, to getting emergency relief into communities, and to help to restore the economy? But we've really only looked at that for seismic to date. I think our next step is looking at that from a multi-hazard approach, looking at sea level rise, inundation, precipitation, and more. So once we do that, I think what that means and how we've used this on the seismic side is we translate those into what we call priority routes. That will be the priority for receiving funding. So in limited funding, those routes stay in a state of good repair that is acceptable levels, whereas the rest of the system doesn't. In the extreme cases, we may even consider disinvestment in some areas. That is very challenging. That gets very political and personal when you think about that. But being truly realistic about what our funding limitations are and how we try to maintain the system the best that we can, those are real conversations that we need to have.
Yes, many, many challenges on many different levels. We have another question. It's clear that past predictive models for precipitation, temperature, etc., no longer apply. How would you envision updating those predictive models using climate change, using inputs due to climate change?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that's one of the things we struggled with as we've embarked on our adaptation roadmap work. And part of, I've been in front of the legislature a couple of times having questions, answering questions with them. And one of the questions that often comes up is, how can you distinguish what is happening because of climate change? So I showed that chart earlier where you have basically the ambient costs of maintenance, and then you have this increasing that we're seeing over time. So we're trying to basically capture the incremental difference that we're seeing between major timeframes. So we're looking at, what's that right time frame do we look at? Do we look at pre-1970, 1970 to 1990, 1990 to 2010? So we're trying to identify what those periods of time are in ways that we can use data from, say, our maintenance budgets and other things to see how those costs have incrementally increased over time. And why I go off on this tangent is I think those incremental increases can help us to understand what those changes look like over time in ways that we can then factor up some of our predictive models and approaches.
Thank you. Yes, it's so many challenges with data, and then trying to explain that to the public and to elected officials gets even harder.
Yep, absolutely.
Another question. So just a reminder to all participants, you can enter questions into the Q&A box, and we'll pass those on to Amanda, and everyone's welcome to add their questions. There was one follow-up question from Yinhai, actually, that I was also going to ask, and you talked about kind of a research wish list. Are there some specific things that we could talk about how the research community could help ODOT and other agencies to address these all the dimensions of these problems? And I might just add that I had the chance the other day to participate in the Oregon Public Health Association conference and talked a little bit about the impact of the built environment on public health, which I noticed you had mentioned it a couple of times. And it made me think, well, maybe we need to broaden our tent kind of and include other constituencies, both in research and in practice. Just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great point. So maybe what I'll do is I'll pull that research needs slide up again. But what I'd also say to your specific point, Rob, is the Oregon Health Authority in particular has been doing some really good research and work around how climate change impacts public health, but also kind of cross-cutting that with equity. So for example, some of the things that they looked at is because of wildfires, what is the increased rate of asthma that we're seeing across? So while I've talked about climate justice and the need to look at Black, Indigenous, people of color, as well as low income, one thing that we don't ever consider on the transportation side is some of those health things too. So, and I know there's less we can do about the wildfire smoke, but there are other kind of underlying conditions like asthma and others that probably we need to be considering as we also think about mitigation. So as we think about the air quality, the emissions from transportation vehicles, that does affect different populations in cross-cutting ways. And so I think trying to understand some of those from a health perspective is really key. I would also say, one of the things to look at just off the top of my head is changes in commodity types in our respective states. That will change as the climate changes. And that has a significant impact back to the transportation system. The types of goods highly influence the type of travel, whether that's rail, truck, air. Each of those we need to be preparing for and thinking about, and it might change it in pretty fundamental ways. If we're moving less from a resource economy as a state to a technology economy, we're seeing very different needs than for the transportation services. So that's kind of another area I would say that's a little out of the box. And then on the slide is just more traditional things that we have research needs for. So some of these topics we've hit on, previously and have some good information on, but probably need to dive a little deeper and a little more specifically. So there's a couple things on here around landslides and monitoring things. I think, we certainly know landslides occur. Is there ways that we can put in monitors to see how slopes are moving in a way that we can know when an event is going to happen, or know what the right mitigation approach is that maybe isn't quite as costly as just throwing a bunch of things at it and hoping one of them sticks to stop the landslide from occurring. So there's a number of things like that that we still need some more detailed information on, that I think will really help us in cost savings in a lot of ways, but also in just making sure that the transportation system remains functional into the future.
Thank you very much. Yes, looking at decision making through a climate lens or public health lens, it's a challenge sometimes from the engineering mindset, where we're so used to benefit cost analysis, and how do you stand up and kind of justify or defend maybe decisions that people aren't used to be making, where in the former way of looking at cost, one solution might fit, whereas a more holistic method of analysis would bring us better results. That's difficult sometimes in fighting that the prior mindset of how things have traditionally being done. But I think the point you made about how commodities will change, I saw an interesting tool the other day where you could look at, well, what will the climate of Oregon be like in 100 years, and the map shows you kind of the location somewhere south of Los Angeles, where we might expect our climate here to be more like that, which will obviously change from an agricultural standpoint, and just as you said, what will be needing to move around. So there is another question here. Amanda, you mentioned a multi-agency coordination framework. Could you please elaborate a little bit more on that in terms of scale and scope, and what are some of the concrete steps or initiatives the framework would entail?
Yeah, so I would say it's a helpful framework, but it is pretty high level at this point. So it looks at the economy, public health, cultural heritage. So it does look at the indigenous impacts, social systems, the built environment, and the natural world. So those are kind of the different facets of that multi-agency plan. In terms of participation, a lot of state agencies, I'm going to forget several as I name through them, really led by the Department of Land Conservation and Development. So it really has that kind of land use center about what we expect in the future. Had participation from ODOT, from parks, from Oregon Health Authority, and a number of natural resource agencies in the state, as well as housing and urban development and others. And so there's benefit in doing that kind of cross-agency collaboration in ways, for example, we saw during the wildfire season with folks that were displaced. How do you quickly use like DLCD's authority of land use to kind of quickly zone an area to set up tents? How do you have the housing industry and health kind of respond within that? So I think that helped to kind of draw connections between very different industries in ways to help serve the public. The other benefit, and I think probably is still lacking to some degree in that, is trying to identify some central and definitive sources of information. There are multiple predictability maps and information out there on the different hazards. Some are fairly detailed, like the flooding. Others are fairly high level, like even the wildfire map I showed earlier. We need some more precise information, and we need to center in on definitive sources, because I think it's better for us across state agencies when we're looking at those central things together and holistically. So in the end, the multi-agency adaptation framework really is identifying the high-level problems and the high-level focus areas. I wouldn't say that it's an action-oriented plan at this point. I think that is, in some ways, setting the high-level context and leaving it up to each agency and entity to figure out how to do that kind of within their work and within their operations. But there's certainly a benefit in some ongoing conversations across agencies, collaborating on how to do this together.
Great, thank you for that response. I just remind all the participants that we still have a little bit more time for some questions. No one's asked a really difficult question yet, so no, they're all actually pretty challenging questions, because this area is, there's so many challenges that we all need to face. I was just thinking, Amanda, what you think. So we're all citizens as well as playing our we have our day jobs, but as citizens, seems to me there's a lot that could be done at the local level, at the neighborhood level, and what would be the kind of top 3 things that you think we all should be doing as individuals to try to make a positive impact in this area?
Yeah, so I'll say a couple on the climate side. So on the mitigation side, I think it's being mindful of the impacts each of us have personally on the transportation system. So as ODOT has tried to really lean into reducing emissions from transportation, we have an important role in doing that, but not the only role. There's local jurisdictions that need to take action as well. But the big response is people's behavior and people's individual choices. And so I would just say, be mindful of the choices that you make and the impact that has short-term and long-term on the environment, and potentially making this problem worse. And then on the kind of resilience adaptation side, as much as we can plan for and prepare, like the photos I showed in the first slide, the environment, even in the last 10, 20 years, has changed substantially. The impacts are so much more visible and so much greater on our neighbors and us. And so it's not going to get better. It's going to continue to get worse. And I think prepare for those changes. Prepare for smoky summers. Prepare for areas being closed because there's more flooding and more issues. So I think I don't want to scare folks, but at the same time, be mindful of an emergency kit, of having water and other resources at your fingertips as some of these things occur. And I think recognizing that we're all a community, and how do we support one another through these things. The last thing I would say is political support doesn't hurt. So it was great to hear from Congressman DeFazio on the great work that he's been doing and really helping to get us funding for transportation infrastructure out of the federal bill. We're anticipating several million coming to Oregon on what's called Protect, and it is really around transportation resilience. So we might have a good infusion of funds that we can use to start to address some of these things on our high priority areas. But the more that we can continue to get that national and local support, the better able we'll be to keep and maintain a transportation system. So that advocacy piece, it doesn't go unnoticed. The more that your elected officials hear from you about it, the more they'll pay attention.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I think that's a great note to end. There's kind of a, although we do have one more question here. I liked how you kind of gave, provided some vision for how we all can play a role, because in order to achieve change is hard. People are sometimes afraid of change, but we're all in this together, literally. So I liked and appreciated your suggestions there. Maybe since we do have a couple of minutes and we have one question from a participant, can you speak to individual choices on transportation and historical oppression of Black people? Specifically, how do we make better choices when so many sustainable options are economically out of reach?
Yeah, I think Nikatris Perkins, who's our social equity manager, I'll give her some props here. I think she's speaking a little bit later on some this topic, which will be pretty informative, but I'll give you my take on it. So often we talk about the first step is recognizing there's a problem. I think we're there. I think we recognize there is a problem. I think we recognize there has been historic disparities. I'll just speak of a research study that one of our staff worked on and was supported by some other researchers that really found huge disparities on the number of serious and fatal crashes for pedestrians in particular, for people of color, for indigenous populations, and others. It was just a huge disparity that we're seeing. A lot of that has to do with land use in many ways and the types of facilities surrounding that. So some of the cheaper housing tends to be pushed out on the periphery of town. Those tend to have those higher speed roadways that are very wide. When they continue to get developed around them, then they're very inaccessible to people needing to get to their jobs and to critical services by walking. There's much higher exposure then of crossing multiple lanes of travel that are going pretty fast, and therefore it's not as viable of an option. So we are starting to really look at one of the things, and I'll say this is very preliminary, but we have a thing called the Urban Design Guide, and that really helps us to identify safer. It's looking at NACTO guidelines and other more progressive design to see how do we create safer biking and walking facilities within our urban areas. And of course, there's a trade-off there, so we have to be careful. Is the highway that we're talking about a freight route? We have bigger trucks that need to get through. When and where do we give priority to certain things? I'll just say my philosophy is when we try to be everything to all people, we do everything poorly. So we truly do need to look at prioritization of routes and users in particular. So going back to that urban design guide, it's more of a choice. It's a menu of options for our engineers and designers to use as they put the facilities out there. And I think where we might transition is in certain census tracts and areas that have lower income BIPOC communities or other. It's not a choice anymore. It's a must. The priority here is going to be the separated bike facility. It's going to be the pedestrian bulb out, so it's a shorter distance to cross. And so we are really trying to start to change how we look at our design to focus on those needs and better accommodate those folks. But also we need to put our money where our mouth is. We need to create some priorities and some investments really targeting that so it is a viable option. Often in transit, we talk about choice users and others. I think we have to look at the walk dependent, the bike dependent, the transit dependent, and how we serve those needs, and then how we truly make the multimodal system viable. So it is a choice, either through safety, through time and convenience, or through cost. And so those are all different factors we're trying to play in as we plan out the transportation system.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you to Tia Martin for the question. And as Amanda said, we will be shifting over to a panel session on social equity and transportation. So I hope we can continue this line of the conversation. But with that, let's all thank Amanda Pietz for her fantastic keynote address this morning, as well as the great Q&A session. Thank you so much, Amanda. I guess we'll give you a virtual round of applause. This has been very inspiring, and we're really thrilled about the role that you're playing here in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest and beyond. So thank you again, and hope to see you in person before too long. So take care.
Thank you so much.